The drawing room at Ashmore had never been so full, and Cecily had never felt so entirely alone inside it. She stood near the window, where the December light fell gray and particular across the turkey carpet, and she kept her hands clasped at her waist as though stillness might make her smaller, less visible, less available to the looks that moved around her like a slow current. The room held perhaps 20 people, most of them neighbors who had come to witness what they expected to be a formality, a confirmation of what everyone already knew. Mr. Silas Croft stood at the center of it, his coat pressed, his expression arranged in something just short of satisfaction. He had placed himself near the mantelpiece, as though the fireplace were already his. Cecily watched him and said nothing. She was aware of Lady Dorothea Vane at the far end of the room, seated in the high-backed chair she favored at every formal occasion, her fan moving in slow, deliberate arcs. She was aware of the solicitor, Mr. Aldous Finch, standing at the writing desk near the door with a document case laid open before him, his gloved fingers resting on the papers inside. She was aware of Edmund Vane, Earl of Ashmore, positioned at the room's edge with his back almost to the window's opposite corner, watching the proceedings with the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize over these 6 weeks. Complete, contained, and readable to no one who had not learned to look for it. She had only learned to look for it 10 days ago. What she did not yet know, in that moment of gray December stillness, was that the papers in Mr. Finch's case were not what Silas had told her they were. 6 weeks earlier, Cecily had arrived at Ashmore with one trunk, a borrowed black dress let out at the hem by her sister Margaret's patient needle, and the specific variety of grief that comes not only from losing a person, but from understanding, very soon after, that the world intends to use the loss against you. Her father, Sir Charles Hartwell, had died on the 17th of October, a Tuesday, between the first and second candles of the evening. He had been a quiet man, a methodical man, a man who kept every letter he had ever received in a series of wooden boxes labeled by year, and who had written in a hand so particular, so individually pressured in its letter forms, that Cecily could have identified it in a darkened room by the feel of the page alone. She had been reading his letters since she was 7 years old. She had been helping him answer his correspondence since she was 15. The shape of his handwriting was as familiar to her as the shape of his face. That knowledge would matter later. She did not know it yet. What she knew, in the weeks immediately following his death, was this. Fernside, the 400-acre estate in Wiltshire that had been her family's for 3 generations, was suddenly in dispute. Her cousin Silas Croft had arrived from Bath within 5 days of the funeral, wearing a look of regretful certainty and carrying with him a copy of what he described as the entail's governing terms, which he read aloud to Cecily and Margaret in the Fernside parlor with the careful enunciation of a man delivering news he had rehearsed. The estate, Silas said, was entailed away from the female line. Their father had known this, he implied, and had simply neglected to prepare them for it. There was additionally the matter of £600 outstanding against the property, a debt of their father's that Cecily could not dispute because the amount was correct, and she knew it. The debt was real. Everything else Silas said was real in the way that a painting of a landscape is real, accurate in its parts, false in its arrangement. Cecily had said very little. Margaret had wept. Silas had departed in a hired coach looking, Cecily thought, like a man who has accomplished what he came to do and is moderately pleased to have had it go quickly. It was Lady Dorothea who had arranged the invitation to Ashmore. This too had the quality of calculation, though Cecily could not then have said precisely whose. Lady Dorothea was the Dowager Countess by marriage, Edmund's aunt by his late uncle's second wife, and she presided over the social arrangements of the Ashmore household with the confidence of a woman who had presided over them for 17 years and saw no reason to anticipate a change. The invitation to Cecily was framed as charity, as the sort of neighborly kindness one extends to a young woman newly dispossessed, and it was delivered to Cecily in a note that managed, within 3 sentences, to describe her as the poor Hartwell girl, and to suggest that a season under Ashmore's roof might improve her prospects considerably. Cecily accepted because Margaret needed the stability, and because she had no other choice that did not involve removing them both to the lodgings in Marlborough that were all their remaining funds could support. She packed her trunk, let Margaret take in the black dress, and arrived at Ashmore on a cold November morning, with the particular expression she had been wearing since the parlor reading in October. Composed, clear-eyed, and unwilling to let anyone see the full extent of what the last weeks had cost her. If this reaches you at a point when Cecily's situation feels familiar, stay close. The story is only just beginning to show what she is made of. The Ashmore household was large and cold in the way that old houses are cold when they are very fine and very underheated, with high ceilings that kept warmth from reaching the floor and corridors that seemed to generate their own weather. Lady Dorothea had arranged for Cecily to occupy one of the smaller guest rooms on the 2nd floor, a room that faced north and received no afternoon light, but was perfectly adequate, as Lady Dorothea said twice when showing it to her. The first meal at the long dining table had placed Cecily near Margaret, and far from the Earl, who sat at the table's head with the expression of a man who has learned to move through his own house, without particularly inhabiting it. He had nodded at her introduction. He had said, "Miss Hartwell," in the level way he said everything, and had returned his attention to his wine. She had thought, cold. She had thought, this is a man who is courteous because courtesy costs him nothing, not because anything about her has registered. She had filed the observation and gone back to her soup. What she had not seen was that he looked at her again when she turned away. She could not have seen it. She was not watching. The library at Ashmore was on the ground floor, east-facing, and reached by a back corridor that bypassed the main rooms entirely. Cecily found it on her 4th day at the estate, following the smell of old paper and the particular intuition that a library in a house like this would be the one room no one would think to look for her in. She had a habit of reading after dinner when the drawing room's conversations moved toward exclusion, which they did regularly, Lady Dorothea having a precise instinct for the angle of remark that made a person feel they had wandered into a discussion they were not equipped to follow. The library was long and warm, lined on 3 walls with shelves that reached the ceiling and fitted with a reading table near the fireplace, and 2 chairs placed at angles that suggested the room had once been used for conversations as well as solitude. Cecily had taken the chair closest to the fire, opened the first volume she could reach, and had been 30 pages into a natural history of the Wiltshire Chalkdowns when the door opened. Edmund did not speak when he came in. He crossed to the shelves on the far wall, ran one finger along a row of spines in the manner of someone who knows exactly what he is looking for, and drew out a volume without looking at her. Cecily kept her eyes on her page. The fire made small sounds between them. He sat down in the second chair. She waited for him to explain himself, or to dismiss her, or to say something that would permit her to respond and withdraw. He said nothing. After a full minute, she turned a page, not because she had finished reading it, but because the silence required some action from her. She was aware of him in the peripheral way one is aware of a source of heat. Not looking directly, but knowing exactly where it was. "The Wiltshire Chalkdowns," he said at last, not looking up from his own book. "Yes," she said. "My father kept that volume on the writing desk," he said. "He consulted it when he was trying to identify birds." "There is a great deal about birds in the middle chapters," she said. He turned a page. I know. That was all. They read for another hour in a silence that was, she noticed, entirely different from the silence in the rest of the house. It did not feel like exclusion. It felt, improbably, like company. When the clock on the mantel struck 10, she rose, replaced the volume on the shelf with care, and moved toward the door. "Good night, Miss Hartwell," he said. He did not look up. "Good night, my lord," she said, and went out. She did not examine what she felt on the way back to her north-facing room. She was, as a matter of discipline, wary of the things she felt in the direction of men who sat in the chairs of large houses and had not yet been unkind. 3 days after the library, Lady Dorothea called for the household accounts to be reviewed before the month's end. It was the kind of task assigned to no one in particular, which meant it fell to whoever was standing nearest the difficulty when it arose, which on this occasion was Cecily. She sat at the small writing table in the steward's room with the household ledger open before her and the housekeeper, Mrs. Paxton, at her elbow. The error was in the middle of the laundry column. Someone had entered a shilling twice against the account of a young housemaid named Nell, a girl of perhaps 16 who worked the upstairs rooms and who Cecily had seen twice that week, moving through the corridors with the careful lightness of a person who has been told, more than once, to take up less space. The double entry would have come to light eventually, or it would not. If it did, Nell would have been required to make good the difference from her quarterly wages. Cecily corrected the entry, noted it in the margin in her own hand, and said nothing to anyone about it. She had no expectation that anyone knew she had done it. Edmund Vane stood in the doorway of the steward's room for perhaps 2 minutes before she became aware of him. He had come, presumably, with some question about the accounts, and had stopped at the sight of what she was doing. When she looked up, he was watching her with the expression she was still learning to read, the one that was not quite indifference, and not quite anything she had a word for. "The ledger," she said by way of explanation. "Yes," he said, and what she heard in his voice was neither surprise nor dismissal. It was something more careful than either. He asked his question about the grain accounts and went away. She returned to the column. What she did not see was that he paused once in the corridor outside, his hand resting briefly against the wall, before he continued toward the stable yard. Lady Dorothea voiced her judgment of Cecily 3 times in the weeks that followed, each occasion calibrated to a different audience and a different register of damage. The first was at the small dinner she arranged for the neighboring families in late November, where Cecily was seated between a baronet's youngest son and a woman from the village who bred dogs and talked about very little else. Lady Dorothea, addressing the table at large during a pause between removes, observed that it was so fortunate that Ashmore could provide some temporary comfort to young women in reduced circumstances, for the season could be quite unforgiving to girls who came to it without the proper establishment. She did not look at Cecily when she said it. She did not need to. The baronet's youngest son heard it and looked at his plate. The second was a private aside delivered to Mrs. Paxton in the upstairs passage, in a voice pitched precisely to carry through the half-open door to the room beyond, where Cecily was sitting with Margaret. Lady Dorothea remarked that it was a pity about the Hartwell girl, that she was perfectly presentable, but that presentable and suitable were very different things, and that one could not really blame a girl for what her father had left her, which was nothing of consequence. Margaret had reached for Cecily's hand across the embroidery frame. Cecily had held very still and finished her stitch. The third occurred in the drawing room, in front of Edmund, which was the one that was intended to close the matter. It was a Tuesday in early December, and Silas Croft had arrived at Ashmore 2 days prior, having been invited by Lady Dorothea in her capacity as the household social arranger, on the pretext of a pre-Christmas gathering. He was staying in one of the better guest rooms. He had been very cordial to Cecily at dinner, in the specific way of a man who has already won and does not need to press his advantage. Lady Dorothea, addressing the room at large, but angling her body toward Edmund, said that it was a great thing for the Hartwell girls that Mr. Croft had handled the Fernside matter so cleanly, for a contested estate could drag on terribly, and girls without protection were so very exposed to the sorts of complications that could follow them into any future they might hope to make. Edmund said nothing. He set down his wine glass with a small, controlled movement. Cecily, from her position near the fireplace, watched his hands and understood for the first time that his stillness was not indifference. It was something held in. She had begun to understand him because of his ward, a boy of 9 named Thomas, who was the son of a woman who had lived at Ashmore for 2 years before dying there, 3 years past. Cecily had encountered Thomas first in the garden, where he had been attempting to catch a very uncooperative garden spider in a glass jar and was conducting the operation with intense scientific seriousness. She had stopped to observe, and when the spider escaped and Thomas made a sound of quiet frustration that had more grief in it than the situation required, she had sat down on the garden bench and asked him about the spider with the attention she gave to things that mattered. They had become, over 2 weeks, a kind of companionship neither had expected. It was Thomas who told her about the East Gallery. One afternoon when they were sitting in the morning room with a book of illustrated birds between them and the fire going steadily at their backs. He said it plainly, as children say difficult things, without the adult instinct to soften. He said that the Earl never went into the East Gallery, that he used to, before Thomas's mother died, and that she had liked to sit in the window there, because the winter light was good, that now the door was kept closed, that Thomas himself went in sometimes, but that the Earl did not know this, and Thomas thought perhaps it was better that he did not. Cecily had kept her eyes on the birds in the book, and had not shown what she felt, which was the particular recognition of a person who has encountered grief organized as architecture. Grief that has been built into the structure of daily movement, so that the person carrying it can keep moving around it rather than through it. She understood, then, that Edmund Vane was not cold. He was very carefully keeping himself upright around a specific and terrible absence. The coldness was load-bearing. It was not contempt. It had never been contempt. The housemaid incident happened 3 days after she learned about the East Gallery, and it happened in front of the assembled disapproval of the morning room. Nell had committed the error of breaking a small decorative ewer while cleaning Lady Dorothea's dressing room. And Lady Dorothea had chosen to raise the matter at the worst possible moment, before the other staff who were helping to arrange the morning room for the afternoon visit. She was not shouting. Lady Dorothea never shouted. She was doing something more precise. She was making an example, carefully, in the register of patient disappointment. And the example was costing Nell something visible in the set of the girl's shoulders and the careful blankness she was maintaining above the cheek that had gone very red. Cecily walked into the middle of it without precisely deciding to. She said, in her clearest voice, that the ewer had a fault at its base that had been present since at least November, that she had noticed it when she had been in Lady Dorothea's dressing room 2 weeks prior, and had meant to mention it, and that if there was fault to be assigned, it was in the original piece, and not in Nell's handling of it. The morning room went quiet in the specific way of a room in which someone has said something true in a context where truth was not invited. Lady Dorothea looked at Cecily with an expression that was not surprise, but was its closest respectable neighbor. "How very specific a recollection," she said. "I have a good memory for objects," Cecily said. Edmund was standing in the doorway. She did not see him until after. She did not know, then, that she had just answered the question he had been trying to resolve since the steward's room. The forged codicil appeared on the 10th of December, the morning after Silas had spent a long hour in the library alone. Silas presented it at breakfast with the same air of regretful certainty he had brought to the Fernside parlor in October. It was a single page, purportedly a codicil to Sir Charles's will, dated 3 months before the death, and signed in what was meant to look like her father's hand. It stipulated that the Fernside estate, all 400 acres, and all associated funds, passed directly to Silas Croft in consideration of certain unspecified services rendered. It further discharged the £600 debt, which was to be considered settled against Silas's inheritance. Lady Dorothea received the document with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to arrive. She folded her hands in her lap. "Well," she said, "I suppose that settles the matter." Cecily picked up the document. She read it once, completely, and then she set it down on the breakfast table with the same care she would have given to handling something that had deceived her into thinking it was what it was not. Her father had written every letter with a particular pressure on the descending strokes of certain letters, a slight leftward lean on the capital F that was his alone, a habit she had noticed and catalogued across 20 years of reading his hand. The signature on the codicil had the rightward lean of a person trying to copy a leftward lean, and overcorrecting. The pressure on the descending strokes was even throughout, which her father's never was. The capital S in the month looked like a signature that had been practiced, not written. She said nothing at the breakfast table. She excused herself. She found writing materials in the small sitting room that had been made available to her and Margaret for their private use, and she sat down and wrote to Mr. Aldous Finch, whose address in Salisbury she knew because he had written to her twice since her father's death, regarding the estate's affairs. She wrote with precision and without dramatics. She stated the specific discrepancies in the codicil's signature, the overcorrected lean, the false evenness of the pressure on descending strokes, the capital S of the month, and 2 additional letter-form details she had not named at the breakfast table. She asked Mr. Finch to examine the document against the original will in his possession, and against any sample of her father's hand he might have independently on file, and she asked him to come to Ashmore at the earliest possible date. She sealed the letter, gave it to the footman James, with the instruction that it was to be sent by the morning post, and returned to her room. She did not weep. She was past the point at which weeping would have served her, and she was aware, moving through that morning's hours, of a cold clarity that she recognized as the thing that had always carried her through the worst passages of her life. Not courage, exactly. More like the particular quality of continuing. Because stopping is not an option, and one must simply remain in motion until the ground solidifies beneath the step. It was Margaret who came to her room that evening and sat with her in the north-facing dark, and did not ask for explanation, but simply stayed, which was the thing Cecily had needed most and had not known how to ask for. They sat in 2 chairs with a single candle between them, and Margaret held her hand, and after a long time Cecily said, "I have done what I can. The rest is Finch's work." Margaret said, "What if he agrees with them?" Cecily said, "He will not. Father's hand is not that hand." Margaret was quiet. Then, "You sound very certain." "I am," Cecily said, and she was. There is a quality to the kind of certainty that has no audience. It does not perform. It simply holds the shape of its own conviction in the dark. And whatever happens next must come and find it there. Edmund found her in the garden the following morning, which was a thing she had not expected. She was walking the perimeter path that circled the kitchen garden, her mantle pulled close against the cold, and he fell into step beside her without announcement, as though walking in gardens in December was a perfectly ordinary thing to do together. They walked one full circuit before he said anything. She counted their steps and watched the frost on the kitchen garden's edge, and waited. "The document Croft presented," Edmund said. "Yes," she said. "You know something about it that you did not say at breakfast." She looked at him sidelong. He was watching the path. His jaw had the particular set she had come to associate with the moments in which he was most carefully keeping his voice level. "I wrote to Mr. Finch," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "You wrote to him?" he said. "Yesterday morning. I gave the letter to James for the Morning Post. I described 3 specific points of difference between the codicil's signature and my father's actual hand. I asked Finch to come to Ashmore." Edmund turned his head and looked at her fully, which he did rarely enough that she felt the full weight of it. His eyes were the precise gray-brown of old stone when the light is flat and northern. She did not look away. "You know his hand that well," he said. "I have been reading his letters since I was 7, she said. "And I helped him answer his correspondence for the last 10 years of his life. I know his hand better than he knew it himself." After a moment, Edmund said, "Good," and the word had something in it she could not entirely account for, something that was not only the approbation of a man who has seen a sensible plan. She did not examine it. She simply nodded, and they walked back toward the house, and she noticed that he matched his pace to hers, rather than the other way around, and she tucked the observation away in the same place she had been keeping all the others. Mr. Aldous Finch arrived on the 14th of December, 2 days after Cecily's letter reached him, in a coach that pulled up to the Ashmore door at 2:30 in the afternoon while the household was assembled for tea. He was a slight man in his middle 50s with a careful look about him and a document case that he kept at his side with the possessive attention of a man who has learned that important papers and careless hands do not belong in the same room. He greeted the Earl with professional courtesy, Lady Dorothea with appropriate deference, and Cecily with the particular look of a man who has read her letter, compared the signatures, and arrived at a conclusion he had come 2 days' journey to deliver. Silas came into the drawing-room at 2:45, having been in the library again, and his expression when he saw Finch was the expression of a man whose calculation has just encountered a variable he did not include. Lady Dorothea moved to take charge of the arrangement at once, suggesting that the matter be handled privately in the Earl's study, among those most immediately concerned. Finch declined, with courtesy, and without particular warmth. He said that a reading of the will in a contested matter was best conducted in the presence of as many appropriate witnesses as the household could provide, as this had been standard practice in every probate matter he had handled in 31 years, and that he would consider it a personal disservice to his client's memory to proceed otherwise. The 20 or so people in the drawing-room, assembled for an ordinary December afternoon, thus became witnesses to something else entirely. Finch placed his document case on the writing desk, opened it with the small, precise actions of a man who is comfortable with ceremony, and removed 2 documents. He held them up together, briefly, so the room could see that there were 2. He said, in a clear and entirely level voice, that he had in his possession the original will of Sir Charles Hartwell of Fernside in Wiltshire, and a document presented to him for verification as a codicil to that will, and that he wished to address the question of the codicil before proceeding to the will's actual terms. The room was very quiet. He described, in the language of a man who is choosing his words with the full understanding that they will be repeated, the specific features of Sir Charles's established hand, as documented across correspondence in his own files stretching back 12 years, and he described the specific features of the signature on the codicil that did not correspond to those characteristics. He named the overcorrected lean of the capital letters. He named the pressure irregularities. He named 2 additional discrepancies that Cecily had not named in her letter, which she was glad of, because it meant that the case did not rest on her knowledge alone, but on Finch's independent confirmation of it. He then said, in the same level voice, that in his professional judgment, the codicil was not in Sir Charles's hand, and could not be admitted as a valid instrument. Silas said, "I must object." Finch looked at him over his spectacles. "You are welcome to contest my assessment in a court of law," he said, with the equanimity of a man who is entirely confident about what a court of law would find. "I would advise you to consider carefully before undertaking the expense." Lady Dorothea said nothing. Her fan, which had been moving in its measured arcs throughout, went still. Finch then read the will. It was not what Silas had described in the Fernside parlor in October. The entail did not exclude the female line in absolute terms. It carried a male preference provision that applied only in the event that the deceased had no surviving children, which Sir Charles did, and which Cecily and Margaret were. The 400 acres of Fernside and all associated property passed directly to Cecily Hartwell as the elder daughter, subject to the retirement of the £600 outstanding debt against the estate, which was to be addressed before possession could be formally transferred. There was a sound in the room when Finch finished reading. Not one sound, but many small sounds, the kind that a room of people makes when something they believe to be settled turns out to have been entirely wrong. Edmund crossed the room. He did not hurry. He moved with the same quality of controlled deliberateness he moved with always, but he crossed the full width of the drawing room, and he stopped in front of Cecily, and he looked at her in the way he had looked at her in the garden. Fully, without the usual slight withheld angle. The room watched him. He said, "Miss Hartwell." She said, "My lord." He said, "The £600. I would consider it an honor to retire that debt as an immediate settlement. For my own account, as a neighbor's courtesy to your father's estate, and as a matter I wish to address before any further conversation about Fernside or its future management." The room was very quiet. Lady Dorothea's fan remained still. Cecily looked at him and understood that he was not offering to solve a financial problem. He was doing something that required from him the particular kind of public commitment that cannot afterward be recalled or minimized, that exists from the moment it is spoken in the same permanent register as a signed document, and he was doing it in this room, in front of these witnesses, in full view of the person who had spent 6 weeks telling everyone who would listen that Cecily Hartwell was a girl in reduced circumstances with no consequence and nothing to recommend her. She said, "That is very generously offered, Your Grace." It was the first time she had used the formal address. He noticed it. She saw the small change at the corner of his mouth. "There is one further matter," he said, and his voice was lower now, the room having expanded somehow around the two of them, "which I would prefer to discuss with you privately, when Mr. Finch has concluded his business and the room has had time to recover itself." She said, "I will be in the library." He said, "Yes." Silas departed Ashmore that afternoon on the 6 o'clock coach with very little conversation and his document case noticeably lighter than it had arrived. Lady Dorothea remained in the drawing-room after the other guests had dispersed, sitting in her high-backed chair, and she did not speak for a long time. When she finally looked up and found Cecily standing near the door, there was something in her expression that was not quite contrition, and not quite recognition, but lived in the territory between them. She said, "Your father's letters," as though the sentence contained a conclusion she had arrived at too late. Cecily said, "Yes," and did not elaborate, and went out. The library was warm when she reached it. The fire had been built up at some point in the afternoon, and the 2 chairs were placed as they always were, at angles toward the hearth. She sat in her chair and looked at the flames and waited. And the waiting had a different quality to it than any waiting she had done at Ashmore. It was not the waiting of someone who expects to endure what comes next. It was the waiting of someone who has done the necessary thing and can afford, for the first time in 6 weeks, to sit down. Edmund came in 20 minutes later. He did not sit immediately. He stood near the bookshelves for a moment, and she saw him look briefly toward the corridor, which she understood, remembering what Thomas had told her about the East Gallery and its closed door. She said, "Thomas told me about the East Gallery." He was very still. "He told me that the light there is good in winter," she said. "He told me that he goes sometimes, and that he hopes it is not wrong that he does." Edmund turned and looked at her. His face had the particular quality it had in the garden, open in the way that his face was only open when he had stopped deciding how to hold it. "It is not wrong," he said, and the words had a roughness in them that was not his usual register. He should not have felt he had to hide it from me. "Children hide the things they are afraid will cause pain," she said. "It is a kind of protection." He said, "Yes." He came and sat in his chair, and the fire was between them, and the room held them both in its warm, particular quiet. After a time, he said, "I have not gone into the East Gallery in 3 years. I have not been able to persuade myself that the grief I carry for what I did not do for her was not a reason to keep it closed." She did not rush to fill the space after he said this. She let it stand. "She was not your responsibility to save from what took her," Cecily said at last. "I do not know the particulars. I do not need them. But I know the specific variety of guilt that arranges itself as distance, and I know that it is not the same thing as having failed." He looked at her across the fire. He said very quietly, "How do you know that?" She said, "Because it looks exactly like what I have been watching you carry for 6 weeks, and the man I have watched carry it is not a man who failed anyone through indifference. He is a man who could not prevent a loss, which is a different thing entirely." There was a long moment of fire sound and settled quiet. Then Edmund said, in the voice he used when he had resolved something, "The further matter I mentioned in the drawing room." "Yes," she said. "I would like to ask whether you would consider remaining at Ashmore in a permanent capacity. I am aware that Fernside is yours now, that the will has been read and the matter is resolved, and that you have no practical reason to consider any arrangement with this household. I am aware that my aunt has not treated you as she ought, and that this house has not been kind to you in several of the ways it should have been." He paused. "I am asking not as a solution to your circumstances, because your circumstances are now resolved, but because you have been the most honest person in this house for 6 weeks, and I have been grateful for it in a way I have not adequately expressed, and I find that I am unwilling to let you leave to Fernside and not say so." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That is a considerable amount of careful phrasing in service of a question you have not yet quite asked." The corner of his mouth moved, and it was the closest she had seen to a smile from him, a small, precise thing that changed the whole character of his face in an instant. "Will you remain," he said, "and give me the opportunity to ask it plainly, in better circumstances, when I have had some additional time to be deserving of a plain answer?" She said, "I will remain, my lord." He said, "Edmund?" She said, "Edmund?" And it was a small word, his name. But the first time she said it aloud in his hearing, it had the weight of a door opening onto a room that had been closed for a long time. They opened the East Gallery on the 19th of December, the two of them, with Thomas between them holding a candle because he had insisted on participating, and they had both found, independently, that they were incapable of refusing him. The room was as Thomas had described, long north light from tall windows, with the winter afternoon pressing through the glass in the particular silver that belonged to Decembers in Wiltshire. There were paintings on one wall and books on another, and a window seat that still held a cushion of faded yellow. Thomas went immediately to the window seat and sat on it with the proprietorial ease of a child who has visited a room many times in secret and is pleased to do so openly at last. Edmund stood in the middle of the gallery for a moment, with the particular stillness that Cecily knew now for what it was, and she stood beside him without touching him, and let the room be what it was. He said very quietly, "She would have liked you." Cecily said, "I hope so." He looked at the window, at Thomas on the cushion with the candle held importantly in both hands, at the light falling in its silver winter way across the floor. Then he looked at Cecily, and his expression had shed the last of its careful held-in quality, and what was underneath it was not the cold she had first read in him, but something she had been seeing steadily, under better and worse angles of light, for 6 weeks. He took her hand. He held it, gloved as they both were, and the gesture was quiet and deliberate, and exactly as meaningful as it was because he was not a man who made such gestures without meaning them entirely. The snow began that evening, as they were at dinner, first a thin shifting against the dark windows, and then a steady fall that whitened the gravel and the kitchen garden and the long approach toward Fernside 4 miles south. Margaret sat across from Cecily at the table and looked at her with an expression that required no words, the look of a younger sister who has watched a great many things unfold over the preceding weeks and has arrived at a conclusion that satisfies her thoroughly. Cecily met her eyes and felt warmth move through her chest that was not the fire and not the wine and not solely the relief of the day's events, but something more specific, the feeling of a person who has been holding themselves upright against a great pressure for a long time and has discovered, at last, that the pressure is gone. Mr. Finch confirmed the formal transfer of Fernside's deed before his departure the following morning, the £600 debt having been retired by Edmund's account that same evening, as he had promised in the drawing-room. The solicitor shook Cecily's hand and told her, with the professional warmth of a man who has handled both her father's good work and his protection of her, that Sir Charles had been very clear about his intentions, and had trusted that the truth of them would hold. She thanked him. She meant it. Thomas asked, on the evening of the 20th, whether Miss Hartwell was going to continue to be at Ashmore, and Edmund said that he hoped so, and Thomas said that he hoped so too, in the decisive tone of a 9-year-old who considers the matter settled and is moving on to more pressing questions about the spider's probable winter habits. The question Edmund had reserved for plainness was asked on the morning of the 22nd, in the library, beside the fire, without an audience. It was plain, as he had promised. She answered it plainly in return. When they told Margaret, she wept, and then laughed at herself for weeping, and then embraced Cecily, with the fierce entirety of a younger sister, who has been frightened for a long time, and has reached the other side of it. Lady Dorothea did not weep, and did not laugh. She sat in her high-backed chair in the drawing-room, and received the news with the expression of a woman who is conducting, quietly and without display, a private reckoning with the limits of her own judgment. She said, "Miss Hartwell?" Then she corrected herself. "Cecily." She said it once, carefully, and Cecily accepted it for what it was, which was not an apology exactly, but was the closest thing to one that a woman of Lady Dorothea's architecture was capable of making, and it was sufficient. Fernside stood 4 miles south through the snow, its 400 acres quiet under the December white, its windows dark but intact. its kitchen garden dormant, waiting for spring, and for the particular kind of tending that comes from someone who wants to be there. The debt against it was gone. The will's true terms were a matter of public record now, read aloud before witnesses in the Ashmore drawing room. And whatever Silas had imagined building on the ruins of her father's estate was dispersed like something that had never had any foundation to begin with. On the last evening of the year, the household gathered in the Ashmore drawing room with the fire built to its full December depth, and snow falling in long, unhurried curtains past the windows. Thomas fell asleep in the large chair near the hearth, and was carried up by the footman James without waking. Margaret played the pianoforte, something quiet and not quite finished, that she stopped at the middle phrase and left hanging in the warm air. Cecily stood at the window and looked out at the white and the darkness and the way the snow made everything both present and remote. The familiar grounds of the estate softened into something new. Edmund came and stood beside her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him against the cool radiance of the glass, and they stood together without speaking, watching the snow fall over Ashmore and over the fields that ran south toward Fernside, over the roads and the hedgerows, and the small buried things that would emerge again when the light turned. She thought of her father's letters in their labeled boxes, his particular hand with its leftward lean, the 20 years of reading that had given her what she needed when she needed it most. She thought of the East Gallery, its window seat, the faded yellow cushion, the silver light. Edmund said very quietly, "You are home." She turned her head and looked at him, this cold man who had never been cold, and she understood that she was. The snow fell. The fire held. If Cecily's story moved you the way it moves many of the people who find their way to this channel, a comment with your favorite moment is the kindest thing you can leave. And if you want to be here for the next story, the button to stay is just below.